So is it question and answer? Question still, or are you going to move?
I could go on and have questions.
So I think that Professor will just go on for a little bit more, and then we'll have another question and answer, hopefully an answer session, but I'm sure there'll be a question session. So over to Professor.
Thank you, Sandy. I'll say a few words about the so-called crime of 1873. So during this period, there was quiet and no great disturbances. And even after that, and then the silver price fell sufficiently, and the miners got organized. There were a lot of silver mines in the western United States. At the time of 1873, there was only one state where there was an important silver mine, and this was the state of Nevada, and the famous Comstock lode, very rich silver a lode is the name, right? Discovered in 1858. And then it was very profitable, and it was still profitable after the silver price started falling. But I think around this time, the silver miners started to feel the pinch. And they looked into the history of that. They had to go back quite a few years to see that something fishy happened in 1873, the Coinage Act of 1873. And they started crying out that this was unconstitutional, this was, they had the right by the Constitution to sell unlimited amount of silver, not sell, but take unlimited amount of silver to the mint, convert it into silver coins at that price, the official price of silver in terms of in the bimetallic ratio gave them the silver price of $1.29 an ounce. And after the market realized what was going on and the silver price started falling, they were getting only 70 cents or even less. So they started organizing and protesting that something fishy happened back in 1873. And then a political movement started in the United States, and they invented the slogan, the crime of 1873. That was, I think, 1885. The crime of 1873. It was started by the silver miners. Oh yes, the first silver state was Nevada. The other areas where the silver mines were, such as Idaho Colorado, and a few others, were not yet formally states. They were just territories of the United States. But during that period, one after another became formally a state of the Union, so that each time a new silver state was added, they gained 2 senators. As you know, every state sends 2 senators to the Senate. And so ultimately there were more than a dozen silver senators, and they all joined the outcry of the miners. That something fishy happened, and they called it the crime of 1873, and eventually this political movement became so strong that they found their leader in the person of William Jennings Bryan, a very gifted orator and clever politician with leftist leanings, with a heart for the poor people and the downtrodden people, and a big hatred for the bankers. So there was a polarization in the country. On the East Coast, the banking lobby was very strong, and as you went west, the agricultural interests also considered themselves suppressed or handicapped by the banking interest in the country, the big banks, Wall Street and others. And there were these mortgages. The mortgage holders were the banks in the east, and the farms which were mortgaged were mid-country, and they also felt themselves enslaved by the bankers, because they contracted their mortgages when silver was still money, and of course when the mint was close to silver, at that moment their mortgage became payable in gold. So this made it very difficult for the farmers to service their mortgages. They thought they owed the money, they owed the mortgage in silver, and they found out they had to pay in gold. And this huge premium on gold, increasing premium on the gold as opposed to silver. So this, as I say, polarized the country, and the debate became more and more heated, and the crime of 1873, and a lot of people felt it on their skins, that something bad was done against them, and they rallied under that movement, and they found a very outspoken and dynamic leader in the person of William Jennings Bryan. He ran for presidency 3 times, never made it, but it was very close. And some of these campaigns, presidential election campaigns, were unusually, what's the word, virulent. And in one of the famous speeches, William Jennings Bryan, who was, they phrased it in terms of the gold-silver controversy, and the gold standard was against the poor people, and in favor, they were favored by the rich people, and so they demanded their silver money back. And one of the memorable phrases which William Jennings Bryan used, that was already in 1896, was a presidential election year. The memorable phrase was that thou shalt not push down this crown of thorns, reminding you of Jesus, who was given a crown of thorns, on the brow of labor, and thou shalt not crucify labor on this cross of gold, a very famous quotation which survived, and it gives you a taste of this presidential election campaign. I think this was the second trial of his to get the presidency on the Democratic Party side, and he was opposed by McKinley, who represented the gold standard, the interest of the gold bloc, and that's the same McKinley who was elected, and I think in 1901 he was assassinated at the Chicago Exposition, so this is when Theodore Roosevelt came in. But that's just to put the thing into perspective. William Jennings Bryan surfaced quite a few years later as the Secretary of State in the Wilson administration, I think in 1912. The hotly contested presidential election ended with the defeat of both Roosevelt, and there was a split on the right, and the Democrat Woodrow Wilson came in, and he picked his Secretary of State in the person of William Jennings Bryan. And that's interesting because, you know, the second year of his presidency, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 was signed into law. And this, in a way, satisfied the wishes of the Silverites, as this movement was called, and it was a reward to the Silverite movement that there.
In what way? In what way, Professor, was it a reward? I don't get
you see, everybody saw it as an inflationist victory, the Federal Reserve Act, that people with mortgages will have now paper money. Instead, they didn't get their silver, but they got something in a way better than silver, paper money, the Federal Reserve notes, which helped the agricultural sector, society, but also in a way the silver mines. You see, in any case, this was the perception. So there is on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., a large painting, which I find interesting. I used to have a copy of a reproduction of that, which I lost, but probably it can be found on the internet, I'm not sure. It's a large oil painting showing the sitting president, Wilson, with a pen and signing the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, and standing just beside, overlooking his shoulder, is William Jennings Bryan, and there's a grin on his face, showing him very, very satisfied with the result. In a way, you might even say, well, I got more than I wanted, so this is my reward, because imagine he sacrificed well over a decade of his life to this agitation in favor of, they call it free silver, because the aim was to restore the free coinage of silver, open the mint to silver. Never happened, but they got the Federal Reserve Act. I don't know what William Jennings Bryan would think if he was still alive and look around what his beloved Federal Reserve notes have done to the country and to the world, right? So, that is the story on the crime of 1873. And I'm just adding, and this is my phrase, the crime of 1971, when President Nixon closed the gold window. Of course, that was not the gold window that was closed, but it was just eliminating the gold standard, the last vestiges of the gold standard. The mint to gold was closed by Franklin Roosevelt in 1933. Okay? He was elected president in 1932, inaugurated early in March 1933, and one of his very first deeds was to confiscate the gold coins and gold certificates which people had, and closing the gold window. So the double eagle was the $20 gold piece. The 1933 issue, only a few were issued, was especially a sore point for him, and he had to track down if they found that you had a 1933 gold eagle, now you were in trouble with the law, because this was the critical year, and they want to track down the last, which existed somewhere out there. There weren't too many, and I say this because if they made some exemptions. For instance, if you were a coin collector, you had some gold coinage, early coinage, or even recent coinage of the gold dollar. There were, of course, the double eagle, the eagle, half eagle, even quarter eagle. There was also a $1 gold piece, but this was smaller than a dime and was never popular, so they discontinued that. But what I'm saying here is that coin collectors were allowed to keep their gold coins, but not the 1933. This was a special effort to call them in, and if you were found in violation of this, it was not a law, it was just a presidential order. And single-handedly closed the mint to gold, which was absolutely unconstitutional. There's just no question about it. But they didn't even bother to involve Congress, and they ended the gold standard. Now, a year later, 1934, the United States did go back to the gold standard, but without gold coins, because possession of gold was illegal, was declared illegal by the president, and as a consequence, it was not a real gold standard, it was a distorted gold standard, because though gold coins were simply not available, and only foreigners could redeem paper dollars for gold dollars. And of course, there was a devaluation of the dollar previously. It was $20.60 an ounce of gold, and the dollar was devalued, so as a result, the price of gold was increased, and the figure was $35 an ounce of gold. But residents of the United States were not allowed to buy gold at that price. Only foreigners were, and foreign central banks and financial institutions. So the curtain fell on the gold standard in the United States and in the world, unfortunately, with what I call the crime of 1971. Just a presidential proclamation closing the gold window. Well, it was much more than closing the gold window. It was the fall of the curtain on a very important period of history, the gold standard. And it was almost exactly 40 years ago, because actually it was August 15th, 1971, and I think I had occasion earlier in this course to say a few words about, since this is anniversary of that date, and some stories appeared which revealed certain minor details, but the importance of the event is extremely high. And if you look back this 4 decades in between that date and today, you will find the very great damage which had been done. And unfortunately, this is not the end of it. There's much worse is coming. So the word is be prepared. I think we have had lots of opportunities to say what to expect. It's not just hyperinflation, it's something much worse than that. It's, and the name is not important, some people call it deflation, but actually what is happening is the destruction of wealth, destruction of capital. This is happening day after day, and the end of the road, it will be probably uprising, blood in the street, breakdown of law and order, something which we wish should not happen. Whether it will be possible, and Ron Paul, the presidential candidate for the next year presidential election, whether he can do much about it or not is very doubtful. At that moment doesn't look that he will make it, he will become the next president. But who knows? I mean, things could start happening very quickly, and maybe he has a chance. But then again, he's an old man, so we just don't know. All right, let's have a discussion, and then I will continue with the story as in terms of China, which is a very important country in that silver saga. So let's go to question.
Any questions, comments?
Criticism?
I would add one comment. So in school I was always taught that William Jennings Bryan was definitely leftist and a populist. It's interesting to me how by representing himself as being in favor, in the conflict of interest that the government creates between the peasant class and the banker class, he represented himself as being for the peasant class, and in 1913 enacts something that is seemingly for the benefit of the peasant class, but the Federal Reserve benefits who? The banker class. So he actually achieved the diametric opposite of what he said he was out for.
Yeah.
It's interesting because without principles, if he's just a pragmatic power luster, which is how, I haven't thought about him in 30 years since I was in school, but if he's just a pragmatic power luster, he has this populist message, and then when he's in office, what does he do?
Yeah.
The seeming exact opposite.
Yeah.
But it's actually the same thing. What he wanted in 1896 was inflation. He got it in 1913.
Yeah. Is he still being taught as a historic figure? After all, he was a failure.
In the 1970s, he was still being taught.
Uh-huh.
Today, I have no idea.
No.
But I was in junior high school, which was probably the last time I had studied him, in 1979, 1980.
Yeah.
And that's the last. I haven't thought about him in 30 years.
Was he pictured as a sympathetic figure or?
Well, I had penned it was called social studies. We had already abandoned history in favor of social studies, and the socialist studies teacher, which is what I called him, was very leftist that I had in that year. And so that teacher was very sympathetic to William Jennings Bryan,
Yeah.
but the conclusion I had in my budding little capitalist brain, even then, was everything the teacher wants is wrong, so I want the opposite. And so Bryan was appealing to the rabble and you know, saying, well, if we make things cheaper, that'll be good. I remember thinking the real problem, this is what I was thinking in 1979, the real problem was, for the farmers, that efficiency had gotten